I pulled into my driveway at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital, and found a bright orange violation notice zip tied to my front door handle. The winter wind cut through my scrubs as I yanked the paper free, squinting at the words under my porch light. According to the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association, I had 24 hours to remove the unsightly extension cord running from my garage to my truck's engine block, or face a $500 fine. My name is Adam Sawyer, and I had lived in this subdivision outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota for 3 years without a single problem. I worked as an emergency room nurse, pulling odd hours that often meant coming home in the dead of night during brutal Minnesota winters. My 2019 Ford F-250 diesel needed a block heater to start reliably when temperatures dropped below zero, which happened frequently from December through March. The extension cord in question was a heavy-duty, outdoor-rated cable, bright yellow so nobody would trip over it, running from an outlet in my garage to the front of my truck parked in my driveway. I crumpled the notice and headed inside, too tired to deal with this nonsense at midnight. My golden retriever, Buck, greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiasm, and I scratched behind his ears while reading the violation notice more carefully. It cited Section 7.3 of the HOA covenants, which prohibited exterior electrical cords visible from the street and modification to property exteriors without architectural committee approval. The next morning, I called the HOA management office and got transferred to Deborah Mitchell, the current HOA president. Her voice had that particular quality I had learned to recognize over my years of dealing with difficult people, a sugary sweetness that barely masked condescension. "Mr. Sawyer, thank you for calling. I assume this is about the violation notice." "It is. The cord is temporary. I only plug it in when temperatures drop below zero. Without it, my truck won't start and I can't get to work." "I understand that might be inconvenient, but rules are rules." Many residents have complained about the visual impact of extension cords running across properties. We have standards to maintain. I took a deep breath. "Can I apply for an exception? This is a safety issue. I need my vehicle operational for my job at the hospital." "You're welcome to submit a written request to the Architectural Review Committee, but I should warn you that similar requests have been denied in the past. Perhaps you should consider parking in your garage. My garage is full of tools and equipment." And even if it wasn't, I would still need to run a cord to install an outlet near where the truck would park. "Well, Mr. Sawyer, that's really not the HOA's concern. The fine will be assessed if the cord remains visible after tomorrow at 5 p.m. Have a good day." She hung up before I could respond. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. Buck nudged my hand with his nose, sensing my frustration. I had worked a 12-hour shift the night before and was scheduled for another one that evening. The last thing I needed was a fight with my HOA over something as basic as keeping my vehicle operational. I spent the next few hours researching Minnesota HOA laws and drafting a formal appeal letter. I explained my situation in detail, included documentation about diesel engine block heaters and their necessity in extreme cold, and attached a copy of my work schedule showing my irregular hours. I submitted it through the HOA's online portal and hoped for the best. 3 days passed. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees. I continued using my block heater, figuring the appeal was pending. On Friday, I found another notice on my door, this time printed on red paper. The fine had been assessed, and I now owed $500 within 10 days. A second paragraph informed me that continued violation would result in additional daily fines of $50, I called the management office again. This time, a bored-sounding administrator named Kelly answered. "Your appeal was reviewed by President Mitchell and denied. The decision is final unless you want to present your case at the monthly board meeting." "When is that?" "Next meeting is in 3 weeks." 3 weeks? I need my truck every day. What am I supposed to do until then? Comply with the HOA rules, I guess. The board meetings are scheduled months in advance. I hung up and immediately started looking into my options. Minnesota law did provide some protections for homeowners against overly restrictive HOA rules, but fighting this would require time and probably legal fees I couldn't easily afford. My salary as a nurse was decent, but not flush with extra cash decent. That evening, I talked to my neighbor, Marcus, who worked as a mechanic at a local dealership. He was in his driveway working on his own vehicle when I walked over. "Man, that's ridiculous," he said after I explained the situation. "Half the people in Minnesota use block heaters. It's not like you're running a permanent installation. I don't know what to do. I can't just let my truck freeze." Last winter, before I got the block heater, I had to call a tow truck twice because the engine wouldn't turn over. Marcus wiped his hands on a rag, thinking, "You know, the Minnesota Auto Mechanics Guild might be interested in this. They deal with issues affecting vehicle maintenance and safety." "I'm a member. This seems like exactly the kind of thing they advocate about. You think they'd care about an HOA dispute? They care about anything that prevents proper vehicle maintenance. Let me make some calls." I thanked him and headed back inside. The situation felt absurd, but I was grateful to have an ally. That weekend, I received a call from Richard Torres, who introduced himself as the regional director for the Minnesota Auto Mechanics Guild. "Marcus filled me in on your situation. This is actually not the first time we have heard about HOAs restricting necessary vehicle maintenance. Would you be willing to let us advocate on your behalf?" "Absolutely." "What would that involve?" "We would send a formal letter to your HOA board explaining the technical necessity of block heaters in this climate and citing relevant state regulations about vehicle safety. We can also reference case law if needed. Many HOAs back down when they realize they are on shaky legal ground." "That would be amazing. Thank you." "No problem. Send me copies of all your correspondence with the HOA, the violation notices, and your property's CC and RTCS. We will draft something and have it to them within a few days." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. Finally, someone with authority was taking this seriously. I compiled everything Richard requested and emailed it that night. The following Tuesday, I got home from work to find Marcus waiting in my driveway, holding a thick envelope. "This came to my house by mistake," he said, handing it to me. "Looks like it's from the Guild." I opened it and found a copy of the letter they had sent to the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. It was 3 pages long, typed on official letterhead and impressively thorough. The letter explained the mechanical necessity of engine block heaters for diesel vehicles in sub-zero temperatures, cited Minnesota vehicle safety statutes, and referenced a 2018 state Supreme Court case that had ruled HOAs could not prohibit reasonable accommodations for vehicle maintenance when such maintenance was necessary for the vehicle's basic operation. The letter was polite but firm, requesting that the HOA immediately rescind my fine and allow me to continue using my block heater cord during winter months. It noted that preventing me from maintaining my vehicle could be construed as restricting my ability to earn a livelihood, which opened potential legal liability for the HOA. The final paragraph mentioned that the Guild represented over 4,000 professional mechanics across Minnesota and had an interest in ensuring residents could properly maintain their vehicles. "This is incredible," I said, reading it twice. "Richard doesn't mess around." He sent copies to every board member plus the management company. I felt hopeful for the first time in a week. Surely, faced with a letter from a professional organization and the threat of legal action, the HOA would see reason. I was wrong. 2 days later, I received a response letter from Deborah Mitchell. The single-page document was curt and dismissive. The HOA stood by its decision. The letter claimed that the Guild's interpretation of Minnesota law was overly broad, and that the HOA's covenants were legally binding contracts that superseded general statutes. The fine remained in effect, and I was now being charged an additional $500 for the days I had continued using the cord while under official notice of violation. I immediately forwarded the response to Richard Torres. He called me that evening. "They're playing hardball. This is unusual. Most HOAs don't want the hassle of a legal fight. So what do we do?" "Well, you have a few options. You could pay the fines and comply, which I don't recommend. You could fight this through the HOA's internal dispute resolution process, which sounds like a waste of time based on what you have told me. Or you could file a lawsuit challenging the HOA's enforcement as unreasonable and in conflict with state public policy. How much would that cost?" Legal fees could run several $1,000s, depending on how far it goes. But here is the thing. The Guild has a legal defense fund for cases like this. If you're willing to let us use your situation as a test case, we would cover the legal costs. This affects a lot of people, not just you. HOAs across the state have been getting more aggressive about these kinds of restrictions. I didn't have to think long. "Let's do it." "Great. I will connect you with our attorney, Sandra Klein. She specializes in property law and has dealt with HOA cases before." Within a week, Sandra had filed a complaint in Hennepin County District Court seeking an injunction against the HOA's enforcement of the cord prohibition and requesting a declaratory judgment that the HOA's rule was void as against Minnesota public policy. The Guild issued a press release about the case, and suddenly, I was getting calls from local news stations. A reporter from a Minneapolis television station came to my house one frigid January morning. She interviewed me in my driveway, my breath visible in the -20-degree air, the bright yellow extension cord running from my garage to my truck clearly visible. "This isn't about being difficult," I told the camera. "This is about being able to get to work safely. I'm a nurse. People depend on me being there." The story aired that evening. My phone exploded with messages from friends, coworkers, and strangers offering support. Several other Meadowbrook Heights residents reached out to say they had faced similar issues with the HOA over other reasonable home modifications. One of those residents was Linda Harper, a woman in her 60s who lived 4 streets over. She had been fined for installing a wheelchair ramp to her front door after her husband had a stroke. The HOA claimed it violated the architectural standards. Another homeowner, Tim, had been cited for parking his work van in his own driveway because it had his company logo on the side. The list went on. Linda called me on a Wednesday night, her voice shaking with anger. "I've lived here for 15 years. I paid my dues, followed the rules, never caused problems. Then my husband has a stroke and I need to modify our home so he can get inside safely." Deborah Mitchell told me the ramp was aesthetically incompatible with the neighborhood character. What was I supposed to do? Let my husband crawl up the stairs? That's horrible. Did you fight it? I couldn't afford to. We paid the fine and built the ramp anyway. They threatened to put a lien on our house. Eventually, they backed off, but it cost us $3,000 in fines. Her story made my blood boil. This wasn't about maintaining property values. This was about control and power. I told Linda about the lawsuit and asked if she would be willing to speak with Sandra Klein. She agreed immediately. Over the next few weeks, Sandra collected statements from multiple Meadowbrook Heights residents who had been hit with what she called unreasonable and oppressive fines and restrictions. The lawsuit expanded to include allegations that the HOA board was engaging in a pattern of arbitrary enforcement designed to harass residents. The HOA responded by doubling down. In February, I received a letter informing me that I was now being fined $100 per day for continued violation of the extension cord rule. The total amount I allegedly owed had ballooned to over $6,000. The letter threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. Sandra filed an emergency motion for a preliminary injunction. The hearing was scheduled for early March. I took a day off work to attend. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Sandra sat beside me at the plaintiff's table, organized and confident. Across the aisle, the HOA was represented by an attorney named Jeffrey Marsh, a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit. Deborah Mitchell sat in the gallery behind him, her arms crossed, her expression severe. She was exactly what I had pictured, immaculately dressed, blonde hair in a tight bun, and the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled genuinely in its life. The judge, an older woman named Justice Patricia Monroe, entered and we all stood. She took her seat and reviewed the case file briefly before looking up. This is a motion for preliminary injunction regarding HOA enforcement of a covenant restricting exterior electrical cords. Mr. Marsh, your client has been assessing fines against Mr. Sawyer for using a block heater cord on his vehicle during winter. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. The covenants are clear. Exterior electrical cords are prohibited. Mr. Sawyer's attorney argues this is necessary for vehicle operation in extreme cold. What is the HOA's position on that? The covenants don't provide exceptions based on convenience, Your Honor. Mr. Sawyer has alternatives, such as parking in his garage or using a different vehicle. Sandra stood. Your Honor, this isn't about convenience. Block heaters are a basic necessity for diesel engines in Minnesota winters. Without one, the vehicle cannot start when temperatures drop below zero, which happens regularly. Mr. Sawyer works as an emergency room nurse. Preventing him from maintaining his vehicle directly impacts his ability to work and provide essential services. The judge looked at me. Mr. Sawyer, stand up, please. I stood, my heart pounding. You're a nurse. Yes, Your Honor. I work in the emergency department at Hennepin County Medical Center. And without this block heater, your truck won't start in cold weather. That's correct, Your Honor. Diesel engines require the block heater when it gets extremely cold. The fuel gels and the engine won't turn over. Have you attempted to comply with the HOA rules? I tried, Your Honor. I submitted an appeal, attended a board meeting, and tried to explain the situation. They wouldn't budge. I've now been fined over $6,000 for using a cord that costs $30 and is only plugged in during extreme cold. Judge Monroe looked back at Marsh. Does the HOA dispute that block heaters are necessary for diesel vehicles in this climate? We're not disputing the mechanical claim, Your Honor. We're saying the covenants don't allow for this exception. If we make an exception for Mr. Sawyer, we have to make exceptions for everyone. For everyone who needs to maintain their vehicle safely. That doesn't sound like a terrible outcome, Counselor. I tried not to react, but Sandra gave me the slightest nod. The judge was skeptical of the HOA's position. Judge Monroe spent the next 20 minutes asking detailed questions about the covenants, the HOA's enforcement history, and the specific circumstances of my case. Sandra presented evidence showing that other residents had been fined for similarly reasonable modifications, and that the HOA board, specifically Deborah Mitchell, had a pattern of aggressive enforcement without consideration of individual circumstances. Finally, the judge set down her pen. "I'm prepared to rule from the bench. Mr. Marsh, your client's position is technically correct that the covenants prohibit exterior electrical cords. However, the enforcement of that provision in this context is unreasonable to the point of being arbitrary and capricious. Minnesota law does not require homeowners to surrender common sense when they sign HOA agreements." Marsh opened his mouth to object, but the judge held up her hand. "I'm granting the preliminary injunction. The HOA is prohibited from enforcing the extension cord restriction against Mr. Sawyer during winter months when temperatures fall below freezing. All fines assessed against Mr. Sawyer for this violation are rescinded. Additionally, I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Sawyer's attorney fees and court costs related to this motion. This could have been resolved reasonably without judicial intervention." I felt like a weight had been lifted off my chest. Sandra shook my hand, smiling. Behind the defense table, Deborah Mitchell's face had gone red. "Furthermore," Judge Monroe continued, "I'm putting the HOA on notice that if there are further complaints about unreasonable enforcement of covenants in this community, I will consider broader, injunctive relief. HOAs exist to serve their communities, not to lord power over residents. This case should never have reached my courtroom." The hearing ended. Outside in the hallway, Sandra was elated. "That went better than I hoped. Judge Monroe clearly has no patience for this kind of behavior." "What happens now?" They comply with the injunction. "You can use your block heater without harassment. The fines are gone, and they have to pay our fees, which sends a message." I thanked her profusely. On my way out of the courthouse, I passed Deborah Mitchell in the lobby. She was speaking in urgent, angry whispers to Jeffrey Marsh. When she saw me, her eyes narrowed. "This isn't over," she said. I didn't respond, just kept walking. I had won, at least for now. The Guild sent out another press release about the court victory. Local news covered it again, this time focusing on the judge's comments about HOA overreach. I did another interview, emphasizing that this wasn't about me wanting to flaunt rules, but about basic common sense and fairness. For a few weeks, things were quiet. I used my block heater without issue. The HOA sent me a terse letter acknowledging the court order and confirming the fines were rescinded. I thought maybe, finally, this was over. Then March arrived, and with it, a new problem. I came home from a day shift to find a notice from the City Inspections Department. Someone had filed a complaint claiming I was operating an unlicensed automotive repair business from my home. The notice stated an inspector would be coming to investigate. I called Sandra immediately. "This has to be retaliation from the HOA." "Almost certainly." "Do you do any kind of automotive repair?" "No. I change my own oil sometimes, basic maintenance, but I'm not running a business." "Then the inspection will find nothing. But this is harassment. Document everything." The inspector came 2 days later, a friendly man in his 40s named Dave. He walked around my property, looked in my garage, asked me some questions. "I don't see any evidence of a business operation," he said, making notes on his clipboard. "You've got normal homeowner tools and equipment. Whoever filed this complaint was wasting everyone's time." "Can you tell me who filed it?" Anonymous tip. "But between you and me, we've been getting a lot of complaints from this HOA lately. They seem to use our department to harass residents. It's frustrating." "Is there anything I can do about that?" not through us. But if you can prove it's retaliation, you might have a legal case. After Dave left, I sat down and made a list of everything that had happened since the initial violation notice. The pattern was clear. Every time I pushed back against the HOA, they escalated. This was personal now, at least for Deborah Mitchell. I wasn't the only one noticing. Linda Harper called me that evening. "Adam, I got a notice today saying my wheelchair ramp doesn't meet code and needs to be inspected by the city. This is retaliation. My ramp was professionally installed and permitted. They're just trying to harass us because we talked to your lawyer. Linda, document everything. Take photos. Keep every piece of paper. Sandra needs to know about this." Over the next week, Sandra collected reports from 4 other Meadowbrook Heights residents who had suddenly received various complaints and violation notices after being identified as part of the lawsuit. Tim, the guy with the work van, had been reported to the city for supposedly running a business from his home. Another resident, Maria, had been cited for having her garbage cans visible from the street, even though they were in the same place they had been for years. Sandra filed a motion alleging the HOA was engaging in a pattern of retaliation against residents who had opposed its enforcement actions. She requested sanctions and additional injunctive relief. This hearing was scheduled for late April. The trees were budding, and the last of the winter snow had melted. Spring in Minneapolis was always a relief after the brutal cold, but I barely noticed the weather. The stress of the ongoing fight was taking its toll. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. Buck sensed my anxiety and stayed close, resting his head on my leg while I sat up late reading through case files Sandra had sent me. The courtroom was more crowded this time. Several residents who had been targeted by the HOA showed up in support. Linda was there with her husband in his wheelchair. Marcus came, along with Richard Torres from the Guild. The local news had gotten wind of the retaliation allegations, and a reporter sat in the back row. Judge Monroe entered, and I could tell from her expression she was not pleased. "We're back on the matter of Sawyer versus Meadowbrook Heights HOA. Miss Klein has filed allegations of retaliation. Mr. Marsh, I assume you've reviewed these." "We have, Your Honor. The HOA denies these allegations. Any enforcement actions taken were based on legitimate violations of community rules or city codes." "Miss Klein, present your evidence." Sandra stood and methodically laid out the case. She showed the timeline of violations issued to residents who had provided statements for the lawsuit. She presented Dave the inspector's testimony that many of the complaints appeared baseless. She had testimony from other city officials saying they had received an unusual volume of complaints from Meadowbrook Heights in recent weeks, almost all anonymous. Then she played her ace. Sandra had subpoenaed the HOA's email records and found messages between Deborah Mitchell and 2 other board members discussing strategies to make life difficult for residents who were undermining community standards. In one email, Deborah had explicitly written, "If they want to fight us, they'll learn what that costs." The courtroom was silent as Sandra read the emails aloud. Judge Monroe's expression grew increasingly stern. "Mr. Marsh, does your client have an explanation for these communications?" Marsh looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware of these emails until discovery. I would request a recess to confer with my client." "Denied." "Miss Mitchell, stand up." Deborah stood, her face pale. "Miss Mitchell, did you coordinate retaliation against residents who opposed HOA enforcement actions?" "Your Honor, I was simply trying to maintain community standards. These residents were making it impossible to enforce legitimate rules." "That's not what I asked." Did you file false or exaggerated complaints with city departments to harass residents? Deborah hesitated. I may have reported concerns that I felt were valid. You filed an anonymous complaint claiming Mr. Sawyer was running an unlicensed business when you knew that was false. You did the same to several other residents. That's not reporting valid concerns. That's abuse of process and harassment. Your Honor, sit down, Miss Mitchell. Judge Monroe took a moment, reviewing her notes. When she spoke again, her voice was ice. I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen HOA disputes that were petty, stupid, and wasteful. This case has devolved into something worse. Miss Mitchell, you and your board have used your authority to systematically harass residents who dared to question your decisions. You've filed false complaints with city departments, wasting public resources. You've imposed fines that are punitive rather than corrective. And when this court issued an injunction to stop one aspect of this behavior, you immediately sought new ways to punish Mr. Sawyer and others. She paused, letting that sink in. I'm granting Miss Klein's motion for sanctions. The HOA will pay damages to each plaintiff who was subjected to retaliatory enforcement, in amounts to be determined. I'm also extending the injunction to prohibit any enforcement action against these residents without prior court approval for the next 12 months. If I see this HOA in my courtroom again during that time, I will consider dissolving the board entirely and appointing a receiver. Deborah looked like she might faint. Marsh was scribbling furiously on his legal pad. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the Minnesota Attorney General's office for investigation into potential violations of state consumer protection laws. Filing false complaints with government agencies is serious. There may be criminal implications. That last sentence hung in the air. Criminal implications. I saw Deborah's hands start to shake. The hearing ended shortly after. Outside, Sandra was practically beaming. That was extraordinary. Judge Monroe doesn't issue sanctions lightly. And referring it to the AG, your HOA is in serious trouble. What does that mean for us? It means you're protected. It also means the state is going to investigate whether the HOA board broke any laws. Filing false police or code enforcement reports can be prosecuted as a misdemeanor or even a felony, depending on the circumstances. Linda came over, tears in her eyes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I've been so stressed and my husband has been beside himself. We thought we might lose our house over those fines. I hugged her. We stuck together. That's what made the difference. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The Minnesota Attorney General's office opened an investigation into the Meadowbrook Heights HOA. They requested documents and scheduled interviews with board members. A different reporter, this one from Minnesota Public Radio, did a longer story about HOA abuse and featured our case prominently. The publicity had an unexpected effect. Other residents from HOAs across the state started reaching out to the Auto Mechanics Guild and to Sandra's law firm, reporting similar problems. The Guild began putting together a legislative proposal to reform Minnesota HOA laws and provide better protections for homeowners. In early May, I got a call from Sandra. The AG's office just issued findings. They're charging Deborah Mitchell with 3 misdemeanor counts of filing false reports and 1 count of misuse of a public service. The other board members are getting immunity in exchange for testimony. Seriously. Very seriously. She's facing potential jail time, though more likely probation and fines. But it sends a message. A week later, the local news reported that Deborah Mitchell had resigned from the HOA board. The remaining board members issued a public apology and announced they were revising the community covenants to be less restrictive. I was in my driveway, working on my truck's routine maintenance when Marcus walked over. "Looks like you won, man. Feels surreal. 6 months ago, I just wanted to plug in my block heater without getting fined. You did more than that. You took on the system and won. That takes guts." We talked for a while about normal things, trucks and work and the upcoming summer. It felt good to have a conversation that didn't revolve around legal battles and HOA drama. That weekend, the Auto Mechanics Guild held a regional meeting in Minneapolis, and they invited me to speak. I stood in front of about 200 mechanics, technicians, and automotive professionals and told my story. When I finished, they gave me a standing ovation. Richard Torres shook my hand afterward. "You've become the face of this issue, Adam. People across the state are paying attention to HOA overreach because of what you went through." I just wanted to go to work. I never asked to be the face of anything. Sometimes that's how it works. The people who make a difference are the ones who just refuse to back down when they're being treated unfairly. In June, the Minnesota legislature passed a bill nicknamed the Block Heater Bill, though its official title was much longer and more boring. The law clarified that HOAs could not prohibit reasonable vehicle maintenance activities, including the use of block heaters and similar devices necessary for vehicle operation in Minnesota's climate. It also strengthened protections against retaliation and gave homeowners more avenues to challenge unreasonable HOA enforcement. Governor Tim Walz signed it at a ceremony at the state capitol. I was invited to attend, along with Linda Harper and several other residents who had been part of the case. We stood behind the governor as he signed the bill, and he mentioned our case specifically in his remarks. No Minnesotan should have to choose between maintaining their vehicle and staying in their home, he said. Common sense needs to prevail over bureaucratic overreach. The news cameras flashed. I shook the governor's hand, still somewhat shocked that a fight over an extension cord had led to me standing in the state capitol. Deborah Mitchell's criminal case proceeded slowly through the court system. In August, she pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts in exchange for the others being dropped. She received 6 months probation, a $1,000 fine, and was required to take a course on proper governance and ethics. She also agreed never to serve on an HOA board again. I didn't attend her sentencing. By that point, I was ready to move on with my life. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA had new leadership, reasonable people who saw their role as serving the community rather than controlling it. They formally rescinded my violation notices and sent a letter of apology. In September, Sandra Klein's firm negotiated a settlement for the damages. Each resident who had been subjected to retaliatory enforcement received compensation. My share was $12,000, more than enough to cover the legal fees I had incurred before the guild took over the case, plus compensation for the stress and time I had lost dealing with this mess. Linda Harper used her settlement money to make additional accessibility modifications to her home. Tim bought a new van for his business, this one with an even bigger logo. We had all become friends through this ordeal, bonded by shared experience. The October HOA meeting was the first one I bothered to attend after the whole situation resolved. About 30 residents showed up, a much larger crowd than usual. The new board president, a retired teacher named Harold, ran the meeting efficiently and with actual respect for the residents. When the meeting opened for homeowner comments, I stood up. "I just want to say thank you to the new board for taking a different approach. This community should be a place where neighbors support each other, not where we live in fear of violation notices. I think we're headed in the right direction." Several people applauded. Harold nodded appreciatively. "We hear you, Adam. The board's job is to maintain property values and community standards, but not at the expense of basic fairness and common sense. We're working on revising several outdated covenants, and we'll be asking for community input throughout that process. After the meeting, several residents came up to thank me for standing up to the old board. One older man, Carl, shook my hand firmly. "I've lived here 20 years. Deborah Mitchell made the last 5 miserable for a lot of us. You did something about it. That takes courage. I just didn't want to pay a stupid fine for something that made no sense." Sometimes that's all it takes. One person saying, "No, this isn't right." As winter approached again, I prepared for the cold the same way I always had. I pulled out my heavy-duty extension cord, the same bright yellow one that had started everything. The first night temperatures dropped below 0, I plugged it into my truck's block heater without a second thought. No violation notices appeared on my door. No fines were assessed. My truck started perfectly the next morning, and I drove to work through the dark, frozen Minneapolis dawn. At the hospital, my coworkers had followed the story in the news. Several had told me they were impressed I had fought back. One surgeon, Dr. Patricia Lee, stopped me in the hallway one morning. "I live in an HOA community too. After seeing what you went through, I actually read my covenants for the first time. There's some crazy stuff in there. You've inspired me to pay more attention to what's happening in my neighborhood. Just don't let them push you around if it doesn't make sense." "I won't. Thanks for setting an example." The holidays came. Buck and I took long walks through the snowy neighborhood. The Christmas decorations were up, lights twinkling on houses throughout Meadowbrook Heights. The community looked peaceful, almost idyllic in the snow. Linda Harper had invited several of us over for a Christmas party. Her husband was doing much better, and their home was warm and welcoming. Marcus was there, along with Tim and Maria and several other residents who had been part of the fight. "I propose a toast," Linda said, raising her glass. "To Adam, who wouldn't back down, and to all of us for standing together." We clinked glasses. The conversation turned to normal things, the kind of casual neighborhood chat that should have always been the norm. Plans for the holidays, complaints about the weather, discussions about local restaurants and upcoming events. This was what a community was supposed to be. People living their lives, supporting each other, not living in fear of an overzealous board member with a power complex. Later that evening, after I got home, I sat on my couch with Buck curled up next to me and reflected on the past year. It had been exhausting and stressful, but also oddly rewarding. I had learned things about property law, community organizing, and the court system that I never expected to know. I had met people like Sandra Klein and Richard Torres, who fought these battles professionally because they believed in fairness. I had discovered reserves of stubbornness and determination I didn't know I had. Most importantly, I had learned that fighting back against unfairness, even when it seems overwhelming, can make a real difference, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. The following spring, I was contacted by a national news program that was doing a segment on HOA reform. They flew out a crew to interview me, Marcus and Linda. The segment aired on a Sunday evening in March, and my phone exploded again with messages from people around the country dealing with similar issues. I spent hours over the next few weeks talking to strangers, offering advice, connecting them with resources. The Auto Mechanics Guild had set up a formal program to help residents fight unreasonable HOA restrictions on vehicle maintenance. Sandra's firm had started a practice group focused specifically on HOA disputes. One woman from Florida called me crying. Her HOA had threatened to foreclose on her home over unpaid fines for parking her late husband's classic car in her driveway. She couldn't afford a lawyer and didn't know what to do. I connected her with a legal aid organization and followed up to make sure she got help. A month later, she called back to say the HOA had backed down. "You saved my home," she said. "I don't know how to thank you. Just pay it forward. Help someone else when you can." By the summer, a national HOA reform organization had formed, with Richard Torres and several other advocates at the helm. They were pushing for federal legislation to provide baseline protections for homeowners against abusive HOA practices. I was asked to testify before a congressional committee considering the bill. I took a week off work and flew to Washington, D.C. The committee hearing was intimidating, with senators and representatives asking detailed questions. I told my story simply and honestly. I explained what it was like to come home exhausted from a shift at the hospital and find a violation notice over something as basic as keeping my truck operational. I talked about Deborah Mitchell's retaliation and the stress of fighting a system that seemed designed to grind individuals down. When I finished, Senator Amy Klobuchar, one of Minnesota's senators, thanked me for my testimony. "Stories like yours highlight why we need these protections. HOAs serve important purposes, but they can't be allowed to operate as petty fiefdoms. Homeowners have rights too." The bill was still working its way through Congress when I flew home, but I was told my testimony had been impactful. Whether the legislation passed or not, I had done everything I could. Back in Minneapolis, life gradually returned to normal. I worked my shifts at the hospital, spent time with Buck, and enjoyed the summer weather. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA continued to operate under its reformed board, and the community felt genuinely different. More people attended meetings. Decisions were made transparently. Enforcement was reasonable and proportional. In August, the community held its first neighborhood block party in years. Someone set up a grill, kids played in the street, and residents actually talked to each other like neighbors rather than adversaries. I brought burgers and chatted with people I had never really spoken to before. Harold, the board president, came over with a beer. "This is what it should have been all along. It's nice. Feels like an actual community. You made this possible, you know." The old board would never have allowed a block party. Too much liability, too informal, blah, blah, blah. Now we realize that community is more important than rigid control. I'm glad it worked out. We all are. As fall arrived and temperatures started dropping again, I thought about how far things had come. 1 year earlier, I had been facing thousands of dollars in fines for using a block heater cord. Now, Minnesota had a law protecting that right. The HOA had reformed, and I had inadvertently become a voice for homeowners dealing with similar issues around the country. The first truly cold night of the season, I stood in my driveway and plugged in my block heater cord without a care in the world. The bright yellow cable ran from my garage to my truck, exactly as it had before this all started. But everything else had changed. Buck wandered out to join me, his breath visible in the cold air. I scratched behind his ears and looked up at the clear night sky, stars visible above the suburban streetlights. "Come on, buddy. Let's go inside where it's warm." We walked back into the house together. In the morning, my truck would start without issue, and I would drive to work just like always. The extension cord would do its job, keeping the engine block warm through the brutal Minnesota night. That's all I had ever wanted. The ability to do my job, maintain my vehicle, and live my life without unreasonable interference. It had taken a lawsuit, media attention, legislative action, and more stress than I ever wanted to experience. But in the end, common sense had prevailed. The Minnesota winter stretched ahead, promising months of snow and cold. I was ready for it. My truck was ready for it. And unlike the previous winter, I didn't have to worry about violation notices or fines or retaliation from a petty HOA board. I poured myself a drink and settled onto the couch. Buck jumped up next to me, something I technically wasn't supposed to allow but always did. I turned on a movie and relaxed for the first time in what felt like months. My phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. News is reporting the federal HOA reform bill passed committee. Looking good for a floor vote. I smiled and texted back. Amazing, thanks for the update. Another buzz. This time, Linda. Did you see the news? We might actually get national protections. The messages kept coming. People I had met through this fight, residents from Minnesota and across the country, all celebrating this progress. We had started as strangers bound only by shared frustration with unreasonable HOA enforcement. We had become a community of advocates, supporting each other and pushing for change. The movie played, but I wasn't really watching. I was thinking about Deborah Mitchell and people like her, individuals who got a small amount of authority and wielded it like a weapon. I was thinking about all the homeowners who faced similar battles, often without the resources or support to fight back. I was thinking about how close I had come to just giving up and paying the fines, and how different everything would be if I had. Sometimes standing up for yourself does more than solve your immediate problem. Sometimes it ripples outward, creating change you never anticipated. My fight over a block heater cord had helped reform Minnesota's HOA laws and might contribute to national legislation. It had exposed retaliation and abuse that had been happening for years. It had brought a community together and given people hope that they weren't powerless against bureaucratic overreach. I hadn't set out to be an advocate or activist. I had just wanted to plug in my truck. But life has a way of pushing people into roles they never expected. The question is whether you step up or step back. The movie ended. Buck was asleep, snoring softly. I turned off the TV and sat in the quiet darkness, listening to the wind outside and the hum of my refrigerator. Tomorrow I would go back to work, back to my routine. The fight with the HOA was over, at least my personal part of it. Others would continue the broader battle for reform, and I would support them however I could. But the everyday crisis, the violation notices and fines and fear of losing my home, that was finished. I went to bed that night feeling something I hadn't felt in months, genuine peace. My house was warm, my truck was plugged in, my job was secure. Buck slept at the foot of my bed. Outside, snow had started to fall, the first real accumulation of the season. By morning, Meadowbrook Heights would be blanketed in white, beautiful and silent. And when morning came, my truck started perfectly on the first try, just like it was supposed to. I brushed the snow off the windshield, let the engine warm up for a minute, and headed to the hospital through streets that were already being plowed. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. It was just another winter day in Minneapolis. Cold, snowy, beautiful in its own harsh way. And for the first time in a long time, it was just that. Another day. Not a battle, not a crisis, not a confrontation. Just life, normal and peaceful and exactly as it should be. I drove to work thinking about all the people who had helped make this possible. Sandra Klein, who had fought the legal battles with skill and determination. Richard Torres and the Auto Mechanics Guild, who had turned my personal problem into a broader cause. Linda Harper and the other residents who had stood up and shared their stories. Marcus, who had been there from the beginning with practical help and friendship. Judge Monroe, who had seen through the HOA's tactics and delivered justice. And I thought about the people who would benefit from what we had accomplished. Residents across Minnesota, and potentially across the country, who would be protected from similar abuse. That was the real victory. Not just my ability to use a block heater cord, but the precedent set, and the laws changed that would help thousands of others. The hospital parking lot was filling up as the day shift arrived. I parked my truck, unplugged the block heater cord I kept in the vehicle for work, and headed inside. The emergency department was already busy, paramedics bringing in patients, doctors shouting orders, nurses moving with practiced efficiency. This was my real life, the work that actually mattered. The HOA fight had been a distraction, a frustrating detour from what I was meant to be doing. Now it was over, and I could focus on what I did best, taking care of people who needed help. My shift was long and intense, the way ER shifts often are. A car accident victim, a child with a severe asthma attack, an elderly man with chest pain, a teenager who had attempted suicide. Each case demanded my full attention, my skills, my compassion. I moved from patient to patient, doing the work I had trained years to do. When my shift ended 12 hours later, I was exhausted but satisfied. We had saved lives today. We had eased suffering. We had made a difference in the most direct way possible. That was why I had fought so hard to keep my truck operational, why the block heater mattered so much. Not because I cared about an extension cord, but because I cared about getting to work and doing this job. I drove home through the dark winter evening, snow still falling steadily. The roads were treacherous, but my truck handled them well. Another reason I needed the diesel. Another reason the block heater was essential. This vehicle was built for Minnesota winters, and properly maintained, it would get me where I needed to go no matter the weather. The lights were on at Linda Harper's house as I drove past. Through the window, I could see her and her husband sitting at their table, eating dinner. Normal life, the kind of scene that played out in millions of homes every evening. That's what we had fought for, really. The right to normal life, free from harassment and fear. My own house was dark when I arrived, but Buck greeted me at the door with his usual enthusiasm. I fed him, made myself dinner, and settled in for the evening. The news was on in the background, something about politics and weather and sports, nothing about HOAs or lawsuits or reform legislation. Just regular news, the ordinary concerns of ordinary life, and that felt perfect. I had done my part. I had fought when I needed to fight, stood up when I needed to stand up. Now I could return to being Adam Sawyer, ER nurse, dog owner, Minneapolis resident. Not Adam Sawyer the activist or the face of HOA reform or the guy who took on his homeowners association and won. Although, I supposed, I would always be that guy too, at least a little bit. The experience had changed me in ways I was still figuring out. I had learned that I could face intimidation and not back down. I had learned that legal systems, while imperfect, could deliver justice when properly engaged. I had learned that ordinary people, when they work together, have real power to create change. Those were good lessons, important lessons. They would stay with me for the rest of my life, informing how I approach challenges and injustices, both personal and systemic. But for now, tonight, in my warm house with my dog sleeping nearby and snow falling outside, I was content to just be. The block heater cord was plugged in. The truck would start in the morning, and I would go to work again. Tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, through the rest of winter and into spring and summer and fall and winter again. The seasons would change, life would continue, and I would be part of it all, just another person trying to do right by himself and his community. That was enough. That was everything. The fight was over, the victory was won, and life could finally return to normal. Real, ordinary, beautiful normal life, with all its small joys and minor frustrations and daily routines. I had never appreciated it more than I did right then, sitting in my living room on a snowy Minnesota night, warm and safe and free from harassment, just living my life the way I was meant to live it. Outside, the wind howled and the snow continued to fall. Inside, everything was peaceful. Buck snored softly. The heater hummed. And I finally, truly relaxed, knowing that tomorrow would be just another day, exactly as it should be.